Florida is a shining example of success in the United States of America and is one of the fastest growing states, both in terms of population and economy. Florida's economy has accelerated rapidly from being a small outpost of less than 3 million people in 1950 to being the world's 15th largest economy if it was an independent country. There's a place in Europe that has the potential to repeat Florida's success, and in this video, I'm going to investigate if Spain has the chops to do so. Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. In this video, I'm going to talk about the economic future of Spain and whether it can possibly compare to what has happened in Florida over the last 60 years. On the surface, there's a lot of comparisons that work for both countries. They both have the best climate relative to their region of the world, in this case, Western Europe for Spain and East Coast North America for the United States. They have demographic factors that bring inflows of retirees and a relatively open economy in their region that would allow people to move there. The question is, does Spain have the ability to repeat Florida's success? And what, if they cannot, what is holding them back? First, let's talk about what's going well for Spain. Unlike some of the other pig countries I've talked about that I'm not as optimistic about, Spain has a very diverse economy. Spain has an export portfolio that spreads across the spectrum, from cars, which are 11% of exports, heavy machinery of a lot of different kinds, particularly in the energy production and utility space, refined oil. You have a lot of agriculture products such as citrus fruits, olive oil, and a variety of foodstuff. They're a big exporter in pork. They're also a big exporter in medication and medical products as well, and even a little bit of technology. And Spain also, unlike Greece and Portugal, has major world multinational companies, which include BBVA, Naturgy, a global construction firm, Ferrovial, Inditex, which is probably more famous for being the owner of the clothing brand Zara than its parent company name, and International Airlines Group, which is the merger of Iberia Airlines and British Airways. So it's not just a tourist spot. And I've always said this in these country analysis videos. You cannot have an economy that solely relies on tourism and have first world living standards. You need diversity and you need real hard exports. Spain's economy has several advantages over other parts of Europe. The first one, most notably, is its favorable weather and culture. Spanish culture and the climate there makes it very attractive for tourists to visit. They have cities with a lot of interesting history, such as Barcelona, Madrid, and they also have more traditional recreation areas, such as Majorca and Ibiza and Malaga, which attract tourists from around the world. It's very popular for expatriates, particularly retirees from across the EU, again, due to favorable weather and its location, and it's relatively close to the colder but more economically prosperous parts of the region, similar to how New York and Chicago became pipelines to send retirees down to Florida. I wouldn't be surprised if London, Berlin, and Stockholm and other colder European cities become the same for Florida as the continent gets more integrated. They have a competitive export profile beyond tourism, and this is key because it's very difficult to be a successful country when you rely solely on tourism. And we can see this not just from the list of exports I mentioned earlier in this video, but we see it in the chart to the right, which is their balance of trade, which after post-GFC reforms, Spain has had a net current account surplus every year between 2012 and 2020. There's a little bit of shakeup due to the pandemic, but it's looking like in the post-pandemic world, they'll continue to have a positive current account balance, which is even more than a country like the UK can say. Their historical ties to Latin America help, it increases demand for Spanish skilled professionals to help with development of those countries on one hand, and they become good export markets for Spanish goods due to cultural affinities. And the other side of it is that it makes immigration a lot less politically dangerous for a place like Spain. Given Spain's high unemployment, they don't necessarily need immigration now, but in the event that changes, they're well suited for it because there is a large body of younger, ambitious people who from more developing countries who share religion, language, and culture to Spain. Whereas other European countries who've had immigration are struggling with it because it comes from cultures that do not share similar values in those things. And therefore, if the economy needs more labor to maximize its potential, Spain is well suited for this. You also have the tailwind of remote work, which is a big one for Spain. I think this is mostly the biggest opportunity, which is a real game changer. Because if you say are a tech professional or finance professional or somebody whose job doesn't rely on them being in a specific city, either a company wide can move their offices or individuals can move and work remotely in a place that's more pleasant and has a lower cost of living than, say, living in London or Paris or Germany or Switzerland. And Spain has had relatively generous rules that either have retirees a minimum spend in euro per day, or for work remote professionals, a minimum income to support oneself for even those outside the EU. And within the EU, due to Schengen, there really are no restrictions whatsoever. The other potential from work remote is a reverse brain drain. Due to structurally high unemployment since the 1990s, Spanish unmarried young professionals have frequently moved to other countries in Europe or to the Americas to seek economic opportunity. However, this is a culture that heavily values family and living close to them, and Spain is a nice place to live in general. So if you can maintain the wages of these other destinations, or even just maintain the employment of these other destinations, but be able to relocate at home, I think it has the potential for a reverse brain drain. We started to see early signs of this post-pandemic in Greece and in Italy, and I wouldn't be surprised if it extends to Spain. However, it's not all sunshine and lollipops for Spain. There's actually a lot of challenges for the Spanish economy. The biggest challenge are structural impediments towards entrepreneurship and private sector growth. There's a lot of bureaucratic red tape that kind of hampers business growth and development, and also the freedom to hire and fire people when needed for a dynamic, innovative company. There's been some legislation proposed to simplify the process and cut regulatory and compliance requirements for smaller companies, but it hasn't shown up yet really in private sector growth in the economic data, and it may not be enough at this point. And every time really in the Southern Europe, and to a lesser extent Latin America, has a similar problem. When you try to initiate in a democratic system pro-market technocratic reforms that make labor mobility easier, which there's a lot of political resistance to people who feel protected by the state of the labor market and cushy jobs, and so therefore governments that attempt to hit the third rail of labor reform and regulatory reform often don't survive very long. And that's kind of what has happened really throughout the region. So that's the thing that makes me concerned, is that will they ever have the political will to make the needed changes, or will it take a demographic turnover of a couple of generations for that to change? There's also a cultural anti-entrepreneurship bias in many of these Southern European countries. The other thing is a shaky banking system. Spain's banks have been really a concern since the GFC, and even now, the Spanish banks are some of the weaker ones in the developed world. Many of them are still vulnerable and have shown poor scores in stress tests that have been done by central banks. Uh, the other thing is that a lot of their banks have concentrated assets in emerging markets that have faced trouble. The most notable one of these was what happened with BBVA and its exposure to Turkey, as the latter country's currency has imploded. It's hurt the stability of BBVA overall. And none of them are like in Lehman mode panic, but their banks are not nearly as sound of a position as, say, the United States' are. The other issue that is consistently a problem in Spain is unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. The unemployment rate in Spain, as of me recording this, is 13.3%, which is considerably higher than the EU average and over 4 times the unemployment rate in the United States. Their youth unemployment rate is even higher than that, and it got as bad as 27% during the peak of the sovereign debt crisis in Europe. A lot of the youth unemployment has been made up for through participation in the underground economy, or young people in Spain, as I mentioned before, simply moving out to other places in the world that have more competitive labor markets. It's hard to maximize economic potential if you have a lot of idle citizens who don't have a place. Like, their exports profile is great, but a lot of their exports are commercialized farms or specialty technology and equipment that to manufacture that doesn't require that much people to make the stuff. Especially as the world gets more automated, manufacturing is going to become less of a hub for employment, even if manufacturing stays onshore. The other thing really for Spain too is their poor public finances and bloated welfare state. Ever really since the return to democracy, Spain has been a social market economy. Government spending is well over 50% of GDP. I mean, if you factor in just to pre-pandemic levels, because a lot of special assistance was made due to the economic challenges the country has faced during that period, it was still 42% of GDP, which is far higher than a truly competitive market economy should be. Like the United States, we have it at about 27% of GDP now, and that is considered extremely high by historic standards. And even among that spending, 69% of that government spending in Spain is social spending. So if you look at it just from a broader scale, you have over 34% of the entire Spanish economy is just on social welfare payments. And this is why it's hard to reform the country, because the economy and a lot of the citizens are so dependent on keeping the system the way it is. And we can see this in a lot of the economic data in Spain. In addition to the government spending data, government budget deficits post 2005, they had a brief surplus during their real estate boom in the mid 2000s, have been well over 5% of GDP. In 2021, is 6.9% of GDP. It got as low as 2.6% in 2018, but it's consistently been very high government deficits. The other thing too is their cumulative government debt is very high. It's 118% right now GDP, and pre-pandemic it was well over 100% of GDP. The best year really in the last 9 has been 2019, was at 98.3% of GDP, which is high, but at least a little bit more manageable than it is now. But the general problem really is that Spain is unwilling to do, or unable due to the political structure, and they've had several governments fail or get delayed to be formed over the last decade due to these problems and the debt crisis in the country that has been a byproduct of these problems. And it makes things rather difficult spending. And then the last problem is the Catalonia problem. And separatist movements are concerned in their own right. I mentioned them briefly in the UK commentary I did. But for Spain, it's a lot more intense. And the Spanish government is not willing to put up with it. I mean, the UK at least gave Scotland a referendum. I don't really see that happening for Spain and Catalonia. But whether or not they should be allowed to secede or not is more of a political issue. The economic issue is really the kind of economic reaction from businesses that operate all across the country are going to react, and how it affects the competitiveness of the economy. The example I really compare this to is what happened to Quebec in Canada starting from the 1960s to today, and how Barcelona, which is the capital and the economic hub of Catalonia, is at risk of becoming the next Montreal. Montreal, prior to the rise of separatist movements, was the economic heart of Canada. Most of the major Canadian multinationals were based there. It was the hub of international trade for Canada, as it was much closer to the Atlantic Ocean than Toronto is, and had a lot more history and generally a more dynamic city. In fact, when Canada hosted its first Summer Olympics, it wasn't in Toronto, it was in Montreal. That's similar to the case of Barcelona. Barcelona's on the coast. Its port is a big hub for international trade. It, not Madrid, was the city that hosted the Summer Olympics in 1992. There's a lot of similar. They're both are very lovely cities to visit from a tourist perspective. I've spent time in both. The problem is with Montreal, once the separatists and nationalists started to gain a lot of political influence in the region, and similar to Barcelona and Catalonia, the Quebec nationalists have economic left-leaning populist policies mixed with nationalist separatism, which that has combined probably one of the most dangerous political cocktails for the health of a free market economy. And both Quebec and Catalonia are going through such government transitions right now. And even though the referendum for Quebec to leave Canada barely failed, the damage was done. Montreal has fallen from the most important city in Canada to a distant second. Arguably Calgary and Vancouver are catching up. The multinationals have moved out of Montreal and to Toronto. Even the Bank of Montreal itself has moved its headquarters to Toronto. And we're starting to see this in Spain. Montreal is about 40 years ahead of what happened what's happening to Barcelona right now. In 2017, you've already seen reports of Spanish companies moving out of Catalonia. 7 of the 8 IBEX 35 companies headquartered in Catalonia have moved out of Catalonia since 2017. That alone confirms that this is going to happen. Although, from a tourist perspective, Montreal and Barcelona are 2 very popular and 2 of my favorite cities I've visited in the world. Their local nationalist movements have really shot their economies in the foot, and I don't really see them recovering. And I think the sagging of these major metropolitan areas and they're losing their status as global cities cannot really do any favors for either Canada or for Spain. However, now let's get back to the bottom line of this video. How does Spain compare to Florida? And I have another one of my state versus country comparison slides here, and let's break it down. First, in terms of population, Spain has more than twice the population of Florida. It's 47 million people versus 22 million people. Nominal GDP of Florida, though, even is only about 20% less than that of Spain, despite having less than half the people, which on a GDP per capita basis means that Florida is a lot more prosperous. They both are very similar in terms of retirees as a percentage of the population, with 20% of Spain's population being over 65 versus 21% of Florida's. I think that number could rise a lot faster for Spain just due to its aging a lot faster than Florida, and also the number of retirees from other parts of the EU is still rather limited. Like, the people talk about all these British retirees in Spain, but if you add them up, they're only about 350,000 of Brits and American retirees who live in Spain. And if you look at expats from other European countries, the number are far less. So combined, like, the non-Spanish EU retirees is less than 2 million people. So there's a lot more room to grow if Spain is able to manage that in a way to bring in retirees that contribute to the economy versus drain from the economy. Unemployment is the biggest spread. Florida, it's only 3%. Spain, it's 13.5%. The top tax rate, that's another big spread. In Florida, it's 37%. In Spain, it's 47%. And that doesn't even factor the differences in how deductions and other things are treated in the United States versus the EU, or the fact that Florida as sales tax is effectively a lot cheaper than a VAT. Tourists, they're very close, and I used the peak 2019 numbers, and Florida has caught up, and Spain is more than 90% there on its way back, and I think both will exceed these by next year. You have 125 million in Spain and 118 million visitors a year in Florida. But really the biggest difference, which is why I think Florida has been as successful as it has, and Spain has not, is really due to the difference in economic freedom, which I mentioned about the culture of entrepreneurship and the red tape that kind of plagues the Spanish economy. If you look at Spain's economy relative to the rest of Europe, it's ranked 26th of 45 European countries in terms of economic freedom, and I support the Heritage Foundation for that. Whereas in terms of U.S. states' rankings of economic freedom, Florida is number one. Florida is, especially under its current leadership, has made it a priority to the last 20 plus years to be an attractive place to bring business and an attractive place for retirees to live and for tourists to come visit. And their policy has paid off with one of the better and stronger economies in the United States and a lot of net migration to the state. Another fun fact, which is not really economically related, but I thought was interesting nonetheless, is the percentage of Spaniards who speak English is the same as the number of Floridians who speak Spanish. You have 22% of Floridians speaking Spanish and 22% of Spaniards who speak English. It's an interesting juxtaposition right there. Really, the bottom line is Spain has all of the fundamentals needed to become an economic juggernaut and become the Florida of Europe at the expense of the rest of the region. What makes it more challenging for Spain is like macroeconomic and political variables are a lot less favorable to that outcome, and also just the overall growth. It's easy to grow and on a relative basis versus other states, especially if the whole pie is growing. Like Florida is becoming a bigger piece and a bigger pie of the United States of America, whereas Europe, the growth isn't there. So if Spain is to grow, it would have to become a bigger piece of a smaller pie just to maintain its current size. And that is probably the biggest challenge, I think, for Spain, really, is that the economic fundamentals of its surrounding region is not as favorable as Florida's are. And outside of that, again, you have a lot of structural barriers, but of all the Mediterranean and Southern European countries out there, I think Spain has the best fundamentals. I haven't done enough research on France's economy to confirm this thesis, but I think it's probably even in better shape than France too, and eventually maybe Germany, depending on how they manage this current crisis they're going through. I'll probably do future videos on the competitiveness of Spain and Germany, but overall, I think Spain has some of the better longer term potential, but it's got a long way to go before it becomes the Florida of Europe. Let me know what your thoughts are. I'd love to hear your questions and comments. The comments in the Portugal video were particularly insightful, and I learned a lot from that along with my initial research. And feel free to like and subscribe and share this video if you liked it. Thank you for watching.